It always starts with a decision. Not a dramatic moment, not a single gunshot or flashing blue light, just a choice made quietly, often in seconds, that sets events moving in a direction no one can later control. In this documentary, we examine 3 separate cases. They happened in different places, involved different people, and unfolded years apart. But they are bound by one shared truth. Responsibility did not end with the person who pulled the trigger, swung the weapon, or carried the suitcase. In each case, investigators followed the trail backwards, away from the obvious violence, away from the final act, and toward the earlier decisions that made those outcomes inevitable. The first case takes us to northwest London, into a feud that had been simmering for years, and a single night that would change how English law understood murder. By the summer of 2020, northwest London was already carrying the weight of a long and deeply entrenched gang rivalry. The Harrow Road Boys and the Stonebridge Group had been locked in conflict for years. This was not a symbolic rivalry or online posturing. It was territorial, personal, and repeatedly violent. From 2018 onwards, police records showed a steady escalation. Shootings, stabbings, serious assaults carried out in public spaces, often within meters of homes, shops, and schools. Courts would later hear that the feud had already claimed multiple lives. In one case, a man was killed due to mistaken identity, highlighting just how indiscriminate the violence had become. By mid-2020, retaliation was no longer a possibility, it was an expectation. Each incident demanded a response. Each response risked escalation. And every decision added pressure to a situation already close to breaking point. At the center of this world was Billy McCullough. Billy McCullough was 27 years old when he was killed in July 2020. On the streets of northwest London, he was known as Billy the Kid, a nickname that carried reputation long before it took on its tragic meaning. Police and prosecutors described him as a senior and prominent figure within the Harrow Road Boys, someone whose presence alone carried weight within the group, someone who was not just involved, but influential. But that was only one side of his life. Away from the streets, Billy was a father. Family members later described him as caring, thoughtful, and protective, a man who lived 2 parallel lives, one defined by loyalty and responsibility at home, and the other shaped by the realities of gang affiliation. This contrast would later be acknowledged in court, but on the night that mattered most, it was his position within the feud that shaped what happened next. Because by July 2020, tensions between the Harrow Road Boys and Stonebridge were already at boiling point. And then came the trigger. The immediate catalyst came just one day before Billy's death. A man connected to the Harrow Road Boys was fatally stabbed. His name was not widely publicized, but within Billy's circle, the impact was instant. This was not random violence. It was seen as a direct attack by rivals. What mattered was not who held the knife. What mattered was who they believed was responsible. Within hours, the mood shifted. This was no longer about defense or caution. It was about retaliation. Members of Billy's group believed that failing to respond would signal weakness, and in a feud where reputation equaled survival, that was not an option they were willing to accept. Rather than waiting, hiding, or preparing for further attacks, the decision was made. They would go on the offensive. Later that night, a group gathered on the St. Raphael's estate, territory associated with the Harrow Road Boys. This was not spontaneous. It was not accidental. What followed was deliberate, organized, and driven by a clear intention. A stolen Land Rover was prepared. stolen not just for transport, but for anonymity and speed. Inside the vehicle were 4 men: Billy McCullough, Isaac Seed, Adele Yusuf, and Daniel Mensah. They were not traveling unprepared. At least 2 firearms were taken with them. The men inside the vehicle understood exactly why they were going out and what they might face. Their destination was Windrush Road, deep inside Stonebridge territory. The plan was simple in concept, but catastrophic in reality. Enter rival ground, catch the opposition off guard, send a message. What they did not know was that the element of surprise would not belong to them, and that within minutes, the decision to take that journey would spiral beyond anything they could control. In Part 2, we examine what happened when the Land Rover entered Windrush Road and how a planned act of retaliation collapsed into chaos, gunfire, and a legal case that would change how responsibility is judged in murder trials across England and Wales.
Just after 3 a.m. on the 16th of July 2020, the stolen Land Rover turned into Windrush Road. This was the moment the decision became irreversible. Instead of a quiet street and an opportunity to strike first, the group were met with something entirely different. There were people already outside, more than expected, enough for the atmosphere to shift instantly. Whatever plan had been formed on the journey there began to collapse the second the vehicle slowed. Within moments, gunfire erupted. This was not a warning shot. It was not a brief confrontation. It was an exchange. Investigators later established that shots were fired both from outside the vehicle and from within it. At least 8 9mm rounds were discharged toward the Land Rover, tearing through its bodywork and shattering any sense of control the group believed they had. 2 bullets struck Billy McCullough in the back. Another round hit Isaac Seed in the leg, causing a serious injury that would later play a critical role in the investigation. What had been intended as a show of force had turned into a full-scale gun battle. As the gunfire continued, the situation spiraled. At some point during the chaos, Billy McCullough exited the vehicle. Whether he was already wounded, attempting to escape, or forced out as panic took hold was never fully established. What was clear was that he was left behind in the street. The Land Rover fled the scene. In seconds, the retaliation ride-out had collapsed. The message they had intended to send was lost to confusion, fear, and survival. Billy McCullough lay injured on Windrush Road. He would not survive. The violence that night had lasted moments. The consequences would last decades. For the men who escaped in the Land Rover, the priority shifted immediately from retaliation to damage control. Isaac Seed's gunshot wound could not be ignored. Rather than leaving him behind, he was taken to hospital. Helping him was another associate, Liban Farah, whose actions in the hours that followed would later result in his own conviction. Attention then turned to erasing evidence. The stolen Land Rover was driven away and deliberately set on fire. The intention was clear: destroy forensic links to the shooting and sever the trail back to those involved. Weapons were moved, hidden, and passed between associates. Some would later be recovered by police, including firearms and a silencer, confirming just how heavily armed the group had been when they entered rival territory. Every decision made after the shooting carried the same theme: distance themselves from what had happened. But while those involved were trying to disappear, investigators were already beginning to rebuild the night piece by piece. Police did not have a named shooter. No clear witness stepped forward to say who fired the fatal rounds. The rival gunmen were never identified. But detectives had something else. They had the lead-up. Mobile phone data mapped movements and communications before and after the ride-out. CCTV footage tracked the Land Rover from its departure point to Windrush Road and then away from the scene. Forensic evidence tied the burned-out vehicle directly to the shooting. This was not a random encounter. The evidence showed planning, preparation, and a shared decision to enter rival territory armed. And that shifted the focus of the investigation. Instead of asking who pulled the trigger, prosecutors began asking a different question. Who created the situation where someone was bound to die? The case took a direction rarely seen in English criminal law. With no identifiable shooter to charge, the Crown pursued an argument based on shared responsibility. Prosecutors argued that by agreeing to carry out an armed ride-out into enemy territory, the defendants had knowingly created a lethal situation. They went expecting violence. They went prepared to use firearms. And they accepted that gunfire was not just possible, but likely. In court, jurors were told it did not matter whose bullet killed Billy McCullough. What mattered was that the men in the Land Rover chose to engage in a gun battle. By doing so, the prosecution argued, they were all responsible for the outcome. It was a radical shift. The focus moved away from the unseen gunman across the street and on to the decisions made before the first shot was fired. And that legal reasoning would soon be tested in one of the most significant murder trials in modern UK history. In Part 3, we follow the case into the Old Bailey, where jurors were asked to decide whether a man could be convicted of murder without firing a single shot. The case against the surviving members of the ride-out moved to the Old Bailey. What unfolded inside the courtroom would test the limits of how responsibility is defined in English law. At the center of the trial were three men, Isaac Seed, Adel Yusuf, and Daniel Mensah. All three accepted that they had been present that night. None of them accepted responsibility for Billy McCullough's death. There was no dispute about the journey into rival territory. There was no dispute about the firearms. There was no dispute that a gun battle took place. The dispute was about blame. The defense argued that without identifying the shooters from the rival gang, a murder conviction could not stand. They maintained that the fatal bullets came from outside the vehicle, and that holding the occupants responsible crossed a dangerous legal line. The Crown saw it differently. Prosecutors framed the case as a joint enterprise taken to its furthest edge. Jurors were told that the defendants had willingly entered a situation where lethal violence was virtually inevitable. They had armed themselves, traveled together, and acted as a group. In doing so, the prosecution argued, they accepted the risk that someone would die. Over nearly 3 months of evidence, jurors heard detailed analysis of mobile phone data, CCTV footage, forensic evidence, and expert testimony. Each strand reinforced the same conclusion. This was not chance or coincidence. This was a collective decision. The prosecution repeatedly returned to one central point. The moment the Land Rover crossed into Windrush Road, responsibility was already set in motion. Everything that followed flowed from that choice. After closing arguments, the jury retired. They would deliberate for almost 28 hours. When they returned to the courtroom, the atmosphere was tense. The verdicts were unanimous. Isaac Seed, Adel Yusuf, and Daniel Mensah were all found guilty of murder. None of them had fired the fatal rounds. The shooters were never identified. Yet all three were held responsible for Billy McCullough's death. They were also convicted of conspiracy to cause grievous bodily harm with intent and possession of a firearm with intent to endanger life. It was a decision that sent shockwaves through the legal world. At sentencing, Judge Philip Katz KC addressed the defendants directly. He described the ride-out as a planned act of revenge, calling it a vengeful sortie that had ended in what he referred to as a crushing defeat. The court was told that this was not a momentary lapse or a spontaneous reaction, but a calculated decision with foreseeable consequences. Each defendant received life imprisonment, with minimum terms of 29 years before they could be considered for parole. Additional sentences were imposed concurrently. Life imprisonment with a minimum of 16 years for conspiracy to cause grievous bodily harm with intent, 15 years imprisonment for possession of a firearm with intent to endanger life. Isaac Seed's sentence was later partially reduced on appeal. Judges accepted limited mitigation relating to his role and personal circumstances, lowering his minimum term to 26 years and 350 days. However, the conviction itself was upheld as safe. Adel Yusuf and Daniel Mensah both failed in their appeals. The Court of Appeals confirmed that their life sentences and minimum terms should stand. Other figures connected to the aftermath of the shooting also faced justice. Liban Farah was convicted of perverting the course of justice for his role in assisting Isaac Seed and helping to obscure what had happened. While public reporting confirmed the conviction, the precise length of his sentence was not disclosed. George Orji was convicted of possessing an imitation firearm with intent after weapons linked to the group were recovered from an address associated with him. Again, the conviction was confirmed, though the exact sentence was not publicly detailed. One individual, Anu Adela, was fully acquitted. The jury found insufficient evidence to link her to handling or storage of firearms. By the end of the case, one thing was clear. This was no longer just a story about who pulled a trigger. It was a case that redefined how far responsibility could travel, and how decisions made before violence begins can carry consequences just as severe as the act itself. But while this investigation unfolded in gunfire, courts, and prison sentences, another operation was already moving quietly through the UK. No sirens, no street confrontation, just one flight, one suitcase, and the belief that no one was watching. In Part 4, we turn to a rural airfield, a private aircraft from mainland Europe, and a cocaine shipment stopped just moments before it vanished onto the streets. While one investigation played out loudly in courtrooms and headlines, another was unfolding almost silently. No gang rivalry, no street confrontation, no immediate violence, just a private aircraft, a rural runway, and a single suitcase. At the center of this case were Richard David Farmer and Blaine Harvey, both 39 years old and both based in Coventry. On the surface, there was nothing remarkable about either man. They weren't known public figures, they weren't living flashy lifestyles, and there was nothing outwardly dramatic about their day-to-day routines. But behind that normality, investigators would uncover their involvement in one of the largest cocaine interceptions of the year. Phone analysis later showed the two men were in frequent contact. This wasn't casual communication. The pattern pointed to coordination, planning, and clearly defined roles within the same operation. Investigators came to believe that Farmer and Harvey were part of a wider organized crime network. Their responsibility wasn't sourcing the drugs or flying the aircraft. Their task was simpler and far more critical. Make sure the shipment disappeared. The method chosen was deliberate. Instead of ports, ferries, or commercial flights, the drugs were moved using a private light aircraft. It was a tactic designed to bypass the layers of scrutiny that come with traditional freight routes. The route was tightly planned. The aircraft departed from Belgium, crossed into UK airspace, and landed briefly at Deanthorpe Airfield in Northamptonshire. It was a quiet rural strip, far removed from major airports, commercial traffic, or routine inspection. The drugs were concealed inside a single black wheeled suitcase. Once the aircraft touched down, the offload was quick. There was no hangar entry, no paperwork, no delay. The suitcase was placed at the edge of the runway, the aircraft took off again, and the plane continued on toward Ireland. On paper, the operation was clean. Private airfields often have minimal staff, security is limited, flights can be scheduled at short notice, and routes altered easily. For organized crime groups, it's a system that has worked many times before. But this flight was different, because long before its wheels touched the runway, it had already drawn attention. Officers from the National Crime Agency had been monitoring Richard David Farmer for some time. What concerned investigators wasn't just where he went, but how his behavior shifted in the days leading up to the flight. Routines changed, movements became deliberate, contacts increased.
By the morning of 23 February 2022, surveillance teams were in place. Farmer drove from Coventry toward Deanthorpe Airfield. Investigators watched as he arrived shortly after the private aircraft landed from Belgium, exactly as intelligence had predicted. Moments later, the critical transfer took place. The black wheeled suitcase was removed from the aircraft and carried across the runway. Farmer opened the boot of his Volvo and loaded it himself. No hesitation, no confusion. At the same time, Blaine Harvey was positioned elsewhere, waiting to meet Farmer once the suitcase was safely off-site. Phone data later confirmed the coordination. Calls and messages flowed before, during, and after the handover at Deanthorpe. This was not a solo collection, it was a planned operation. To an untrained eye, the scene might have looked uneventful. To the officers watching, this was the moment suspicion became certainty. And as Farmer drove toward the exit of the airfield, carrying what investigators believed to be millions of pounds worth of cocaine, the surveillance phase ended. The enforcement phase began. Armed officers allowed Farmer to leave the immediate vicinity of the runway, ensuring the transfer was complete and removing any doubt about possession. Then they moved in. Farmer's vehicle was brought to a controlled stop. Armed officers approached with weapons drawn. Body-worn camera footage later released showed Farmer being ordered from the car and placed face down on the ground. The boot was opened. Inside was the suitcase. When officers unzipped it, there was no ambiguity. Inside were 50 tightly wrapped packages, sealed in brown tape, consistent with wholesale cocaine packaging. The haul weighed approximately 50 kilograms, with an estimated street value of 4 million pounds. The drugs were Class A cocaine, intended not for a single area, but for distribution across multiple regions of England. The seizure stopped the shipment reaching the streets, but the investigation was far from over, because attention now turned to the wider network and to the man who had been waiting nearby, ready to help move the drugs onward. In Part 5, we follow the investigation as it widens across counties and borders, exposing an international supply chain that stretched far beyond one rural runway. With the cocaine seized and Richard David Farmer in custody, investigators moved quickly to widen the scope of the operation. Stopping the drugs at the airfield had prevented them reaching the streets, but it had also confirmed something far more significant. This was not an isolated collection. It was part of a structured supply chain designed to move large quantities of Class A drugs quietly and efficiently across the country. Attention turned immediately to Blaine Harvey. Although he had not been present at the runway, phone data placed him firmly inside the operation. Messages, call timing, and location analysis showed that Harvey had been in constant contact with Farmer before, during, and after the transfer at Deanthorpe. Investigators believed the roles were clear. Farmer was responsible for physical collection. Harvey was positioned to manage onward movement. Neither role worked without the other. Forensic analysis of Farmer's mobile phone provided critical insight. Officers recovered contact lists, deleted messages, and location data that mapped the wider distribution plan. The cocaine was not destined for a single city. Evidence presented in court showed the shipment was intended to be moved through Bedfordshire, Cambridgeshire, Northamptonshire, Coventry, Kent, and Essex. This was a regional operation, not a local one, designed to spread risk and maximize profit. In April 2022, officers arrested Blaine Harvey at his home in Coventry. By that stage, investigators were confident they had sufficient evidence to charge him with conspiracy to supply Class A drugs, even though he had never physically handled the cocaine. The case demonstrated a key principle in organized crime prosecutions. Presence is not required when coordination and intent can be proven. The investigation did not stop at the UK border. After offloading the suitcase, the private aircraft continued its journey to Ireland. When it landed at Waterford Airport, it was met by Irish customs and police officers acting on intelligence shared by UK authorities. 3 men on board, nationals of Sweden and Lithuania, were arrested. Mobile phones and cash were seized, and the aircraft itself became part of the investigation. The international element was coordinated through Interpol, with European arrest warrants issued as authorities worked across borders to identify roles within the supply chain. The 3 men were later extradited to Sweden, where they were convicted of drug-related offenses connected to the same operation. What began as a single suitcase on a rural runway had now exposed a trafficking route stretching from mainland Europe to the UK and Ireland. Back in England, the focus returned to the courts. The case against Richard David Farmer and Blaine Harvey was heard at Northampton Crown Court. Prosecutors laid out the full scale of the operation, presenting evidence of planning, coordination, and clear intent to supply Class A drugs on a large scale. Both men denied knowingly being involved in the importation of cocaine. The jury disagreed. On 16 July 2025, guilty verdicts were returned against both defendants. Sentencing followed shortly afterwards. Farmer was sentenced to 12 years imprisonment. Harvey received 12 years and 6 months, with the judge noting his role in coordinating the onward movement of the drugs. For both men, the operation ended not with quiet distribution, but with long prison sentences. For the wider network, it marked the collapse of a carefully planned route into the UK. In this case, police intervention came just in time. But not every investigation reaches its target before it's too late. In Part 6, we turn to Manchester, where a young father left home one night and was never seen alive again.
The final case begins far from courtrooms and airfields. It starts in Moss Side, Manchester. Ree Thompson was 29 years old. To family and friends, he was known by his nickname, Vipes, a name that carried warmth rather than notoriety. At the time of his death, Ree was working as a courier driver, spending long hours on the road to support the people closest to him. He had once planned to attend Salford University, but his priorities shifted after becoming a father. Responsibility came first. Family members later described him as a devoted dad and a committed partner, someone whose focus had narrowed to providing stability and being present. In tributes released after his death, relatives spoke of a man who was generous, loyal, and deeply caring. They described him as someone with a big heart, always willing to help when he could. Nothing about Ree's day-to-day life suggested that his name would soon be linked to a homicide investigation. But behind the ordinary routines of work and family, events were already in motion, events that would unfold in a matter of hours. In the early hours of Thursday, 13 May 2021, Ree left Moss Side with 3 other men. Their destination was Delaney Road in Crumpsall, North Manchester. Investigators later confirmed this was not a random journey. Evidence gathered during the police investigation and inquest suggested the group believed a cannabis grow was operating at the address. Intelligence indicated the grow was linked to an Albanian organized crime group, a detail that significantly raised the risk of violence. The purpose of the visit was described as a taxing operation, a term used within criminal networks to describe the theft of drugs or proceeds from rival groups. It was a decision that carried immediate and serious danger. Sometime around 3:40 a.m., the group arrived on Delaney Road. What they expected to find remains unclear. What followed was not a brief confrontation. Police later concluded that the group were met by individuals already prepared for violence. Evidence pointed toward an ambush rather than a spontaneous clash. A 999 call made during the incident reported a fight involving multiple men armed with metal bars. The call suggested the attackers had arrived equipped, indicating the violence was anticipated. The situation escalated rapidly. As the disturbance unfolded, Ree attempted to escape.
He entered a white transit van parked nearby and tried to drive away from the scene. He didn't get far. The van was attacked and brought to a stop before he could leave the area. What happened next marked the last confirmed sighting of Ree Thompson alive. According to findings later outlined at the inquest, Ree was pulled from the vehicle, assaulted at the scene, and then forced into another car. That vehicle left Delaney Road shortly afterwards. By the time police arrived in response to the emergency call, the street was quiet. The vehicles were gone, and Ree Thompson had vanished. In Part 7, we follow the investigation as it moves from a Manchester street to a remote moorland road, where a grim discovery would raise more questions than answers. Just a few hours after Ree Thompson disappeared from Delaney Road, the investigation took a devastating turn. At 6:40 a.m. on 13 May 2021, police in West Yorkshire were called to reports of a body found on a remote private track in Rishworth, Calderdale. The location was starkly different from the busy Manchester street where Ree had last been seen. This was open moorland near Booth Wood Reservoir, quiet, isolated, miles from any residential area. Officers arriving at the scene quickly confirmed the body was that of Ree Thompson. There was no attempt to conceal him. He had been left in the open, on a track more commonly used by walkers and local residents than by passing traffic. The isolation of the spot only deepened the mystery of how and why he had been taken there. The distance between Crumpsall and the moorland location made one thing clear almost immediately. Ree had been transported. A post-mortem examination revealed the full extent of what Ree had endured in the hours before his death. The findings were severe. Ree had suffered multiple blows to the head, inflicted with a heavy blunt object. These injuries were described by medical experts as fatal. In addition, he had sustained broken hands, a fractured forearm, and a broken leg, alongside extensive bruising and abrasions across his body. Some of these injuries were identified as defensive wounds, suggesting he had attempted to protect himself during the assault. Investigators also noted that parcel tape had been found around Ree's wrists and neck when his body was discovered. A length of similar tape was located nearby. Early speculation raised the possibility of strangulation. However, the forensic pathologist concluded there was no evidence the tape had compressed his neck. Instead, it was believed to have been used as a restraint or to assist in moving his body. The official cause of death was recorded as head injuries. The assault was described as prolonged rather than a single fatal strike. Detectives from Greater Manchester Police launched a full homicide investigation under Operation Lynn. From the outset, investigators treated Ree Thompson's death as a targeted attack directly linked to the disturbance on Delaney Road just hours earlier. The timeline left little doubt that the two events were connected. CCTV footage, phone data, and vehicle movements became central to the inquiry. Officers traced possible routes between Manchester and Calderdale, searching for any sighting that could explain how Ree was transported across counties during the night. Public appeals were repeatedly issued. Police urged anyone who had seen or heard anything in Crumpsall or near Rishworth during the early hours of 13 May to come forward, even if the information seemed insignificant at the time. As the investigation progressed, multiple arrests were made across Great Manchester and Cambridge. Men aged between their mid-20s and late 30s were detained on suspicion of murder or conspiracy to murder. They were questioned at length. Phones were seized. Movements were analyzed. Associates were examined. Despite the seriousness of the allegations, those arrested were later released pending further inquiries, reflecting the difficulty of proving individual responsibility in a case involving multiple suspects and cross-county movement. As the investigation continued, detectives made a fifth arrest, signaling a shift in focus. Investigators began exploring whether Ree's death was a result of a coordinated plan rather than a spontaneous escalation of violence. The possibility of a conspiracy widened the scope of the case, but also raised the evidential threshold prosecutors would need to meet. Police confirmed the investigation remained active and ongoing. No charges had yet been brought. And while many questions had been answered about what happened that night, one remained unresolved. Who was responsible for Ree Thompson's death? In Part 8, we step back to examine the unanswered questions, the wider impact of these cases, and how each story shows that a single decision can carry consequences no one can escape.
By the time the facts of these 3 cases had emerged, the scale and consequences of each decision were clear. But the investigations left lingering questions that highlighted the complexity of modern organized crime in the UK. Billy McCullough's murder showed how a single night, fueled by revenge and long-standing rivalry, could escalate into tragedy. Though the shooters themselves were never identified, the law found a way to assign shared responsibility, establishing a precedent for cases involving group violence. It raised debates on joint enterprise, ethics, and accountability. The cocaine seizure at Denethorpe Airfield demonstrated the reach of organized crime, spanning multiple countries and counties. For Richard David Farmer and Blaine Harvey, a single suitcase and one well-coordinated plan led to years behind bars. Yet the case also revealed the sophistication of drug networks and how law enforcement surveillance, intelligence, and international cooperation are critical in stopping the flow before it reaches the streets. Finally, Ree Thompson's death highlighted the unpredictable consequences of involvement in criminal activities, even indirectly. Though the perpetrators were eventually identified, the timeline and brutality of the attack shocked communities. It reminded investigators and the public alike that violence can escalate far beyond the immediate scene, crossing counties, leaving families devastated, and raising questions about protection, policing, and prevention. These cases collectively underline a single truth. Every decision matters, every choice carries risk, and sometimes consequences extend far beyond the individuals involved. Communities affected by these events felt the impact for years. Policies and practices around gang violence, drug trafficking, and cross-border crime have been scrutinized and, in some areas, adjusted. Awareness campaigns and community initiatives have grown in response to the public outrage and investigative lessons learned. The stories of Billy McCullough, Richard Farmer, Blaine Harvey, and Ree Thompson are cautionary tales. They are reminders of the fragility of life, the reach of organized crime, and the unforeseen chain reactions that follow choices made in moments of anger, greed, or desperation. As we close this episode of UK Crime Documentaries, reflect on the lives disrupted, the lessons learned, and the responsibility that comes with every action. While some questions remain, the stories are preserved, not to sensationalize, but to inform, educate, and remember. If you found this breakdown informative, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss future episodes. And share your thoughts in the comments. What do you think about the decisions, consequences, and sentences in these cases?